Good morning. Today I want to talk about suffering, and like trials, because I was just listening to a podcast this morning actually about like if God is good, why does he allow suffering? And basically like the person's point was that God created humans in order to have a loving relationship with his creation. Like he created humans so that he wasn't like in this dictatorship. It was like he had a relationship with what he made. And he wanted his creation to love him as much as he loved them. And so, but love means that you have to be able to choose. Like, it doesn't really mean anything to love someone if you're forced to love them. So because God wanted us to love him by choice, he had to give us the ability to choose. And that also comes with the flip side of not choosing him. And that's basically why there's sin in the world, why there's suffering. And even if you do follow God, like you could still face the backlash of suffering because of sin, is basically the point she was making. But another point that I was thinking about was from Daniel, and I think it's it's all messed up now. I think it's chapter 3, Daniel chapter 3, question mark. And basically Daniel is the Babylonians take over like Israel, and the Israelites like had certain practices that they would do because they wanted to follow God and follow the commandments and all that stuff. The Babylonians didn't believe in the same things, so when they took over Israel, they were kind of just trying to force their beliefs onto everybody. And if you didn't just like fall into line with what they said, you would usually get killed. So, and part of what the Babylonian king did, I think it was Nebuchadnezzar, yeah. What he did when they captured Israel was also like find the most fit men, the fit young men that are the most like eligible to become really good warriors, and basically train them up into the Babylonian culture so that he could strengthen his army, his leadership, all that stuff. So there's basically 3 guys in this chapter. It's Daniel and 2 other friends. I know one is Abednego and the other one's like Meshach. I don't know. But basically, he gives them new Babylonian names. He has them live a Babylonian lifestyle. Like, he's basically trying to brainwash them from all the tradition and lifestyle that they learned in Israel into being like Babylonians. And basically changing their beliefs, changing the way they live, changing their identity as a whole, to believe what he believes and not worship God, basically. And I'm going somewhere with this. I'm just giving background because, but basically don't count on me for this. Go read Daniel chapter 3. Read all of Daniel, honestly, because it's really good. But when it comes to suffering and like trials, I was thinking about like in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon that took over all this, is basically he builds like this idol and is like, everyone has to worship this. Whenever they hear like the music playing and whatever, they must immediately fall down and worship this. And as like a way, he basically wanted everyone to somehow be like united under him so that his leadership could be made stronger. But he did that through the root of like fear. So basically he was like, if you don't bow down the second we tell you to, or you resist, like you'll be thrown into a furnace, like, and burned to death, basically. And so earlier in the first 2 chapters of Daniel, you see that Daniel like made a promise in his heart, like to not change who he was and like the God that he served, even though he was under this Babylonian control. Even though they were trying to change his identity, even though they were trying to brainwash him into being like them, he basically was like, I'm going to stay true to who I am and God and who I know God is. And so even with that, God was watching over him and made him one of the best, and Nebuchadnezzar like has an affection for him because he's like, wow, this guy's really good. So it leads up to chapter 3, where basically Nebuchadnezzar makes this decree, like, if you don't bow down and worship this idol whenever we say to, then you're going to be thrown into the furnace and killed. So Daniel is somewhere with these 2 other guys, and basically the music plays and they don't bow down because they're not going to worship a false idol. And and so Nebuchadnezzar has people come report to him and be like, hey, like, those guys that you say all this good stuff about that you're training up, like, they didn't listen, and so you basically have to give them the consequences that you said everyone's gonna get. And so basically Nebuchadnezzar is like, oh, I don't want to kill them because I like them and they can help me out in the future. And so he's like, okay, bring them to me. I'm sure it's like a big misunderstanding, right? And this is just me like chopping it up. This is not word for word. And so anyway, he brings them to him and he's like, gives them one more chance basically, and they still say no. So then he has these really strong men tie them up and throw them into the fire. And basically, when he's having this conversation with them before that, he's like, so why would you still serve this God if he's going to allow you now to be killed, like, burned, you know what I mean? And they basically, something that's such a strong point in that scripture for me was, like, they said that whether God saves us or not, like, this is what he wants us to do, and we have faith that whatever he wants to happen is going to happen. And I think that's so crazy because, like, they had conviction even knowing that God might not bless them or God might not save them. Like, they loved God so much that it didn't matter if God got them out of the situation, they were still going to be faithful. And I think that's something that, like, is so powerful that we should all strive to do, is, like, even when the situation is bad, and even though we know God has the power to, like, end the stuff that we're dealing with immediately, but he doesn't, that still doesn't mean that still should not mean that we don't serve him anymore, because we are completely undeserving of the mercy and the blessings that he gives us. So to throw it away when we don't get things fixed when we want them to be fixed, or when we're uncomfortable, you know, is not really fair. So I just think that's really powerful. Like, they knew that their God might not save them, just like God might not heal you, just like God might not work things out for a certain opportunity. Like, God's plan is bigger, and they realized that, like, it's not all about them. Like, whether they get saved or not, like, this is about God and not them. So they were like, this is the decision we're making. We don't care if we get anything out of it. You know what I mean? So what happens is they get thrown into the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar and his soldiers are kind of watching, and they're like, okay, like, what's going on? And then they see that there's 4 people in the fire. Now, it was Daniel and his 2 friends that were thrown into the fire, so they're like, why is there a 4th person in there? Like, a 4th person? And this is where all these worship songs come about, like the 4th man in the fire and all that stuff. But basically, it was a manifestation of, I think they call it a Christophany, like a manifestation of God, like in human form, that we see, like, before Jesus came. And so basically, spoiler alert, they don't die. And when they're like, oh my gosh, why is there a 4th person in there? So they open the door, and out comes the 3 men, Daniel and his 2 friends, and they're not burnt at all. There's not a scorch. They don't smell like fire, nothing like that. And they're like, oh my gosh, like, your God saved you. Like, basically, you know, it's basically proved to them, like, wow, like, your God is real, and he's the real God. And it actually leads to Nebuchadnezzar changing his decree that the whole of his empire should actually worship the God that Daniel and his friends worship, which is like, but it's just interesting that, like, my 2 takeaways are, like, even if we don't get the outcome of the situation that we want, we should still have faith in God. Because even if they did die, they loved God so much that if that's what his plan was for them, that's what his plan was for them. And that goes back to like surrender. Like some trials that we go through, we bring ourselves to because of choices that we made, sins that we've done. It's of our own consequence. Sometimes we bring ourselves to a trial, and sometimes God brings us through a trial. And so, sometimes God will bring us through trials to be closer to him. And that's the second point. Like the Christophany, like the literal fourth man in the fire, they would have never experienced seeing God like in that form or even being that close to God unless they went through the fiery furnace. Like we cannot truly know God to a certain, like there's only a certain threshold that you can know God without going through some hard stuff. Like the times that my spirituality has grown the most is when I've been in the hardest seasons of my life. And so that's another thing about suffering, like it brings you closer to God. And you can only get so close to God without going through things. And so it's like, again, what I was saying about going through a situation, God will take us through things sometimes to grow us closer to him and to grow like as a person so that we can better reflect him, better represent him, better be advocates for him. And so as much as suffering, like it's not comfortable, it sucks, like we don't want to suffer, but at the same time it's like that's the only thing that really will draw you so close to God. And that's also like we need to be okay with knowing that it's not going to always turn out the way that we want it to, or it's not always going to be fixed immediately. And just because God can do it and doesn't make him any less good, if you know what I'm saying. So yeah, and I think there was one more thing I wanted to say. The last point that I want to make is also like God also suffered. So it's not like he's just bringing us through things for fun or because he wants us to suffer. Like he suffered. He literally, like Jesus was crucified on a cross and he didn't deserve it at all. Like he was literally perfect and received the worst possible punishment and suffering that anyone could ever experience. And we're over here imperfect and we're upset when we suffer at a lower extreme. So just think about that. Like God, there's also a verse that's like we don't serve a high priest. We serve a high priest who can empathize with our suffering. Like basically there's nothing that we go through that God doesn't empathize with, that God hasn't been through. Like, and he shows us through Jesus like how we're supposed to navigate those things because he was able to navigate every single challenge, every single trial, every single temptation perfectly. And he's literally the model of how we want to navigate suffering. And so again, I just think that's really important. And also God promises that like he'll work everything to our good. So whether he's bringing us through a trial or whether we're brought ourselves to a trial, if we turn to him, it's not gonna go to waste. We're gonna learn from it. It's gonna bless us later on, and it's gonna help us grow to be a better person. So that's all. Everyone have a great day. And yeah.